Well, good afternoon, everybody. As chair of the Atlantic Council and representing the entire Atlantic Council family, including our intrepid leader, Fred Kemp, it's an honor to welcome you all to this very special gathering. Today, we are celebrating the launch event of the South Asia Center's U.S.-India Trade Initiative. In particular, I'd like to extend a special and warm welcome to our guests of honor, Senator John Cornyn and Senator Mark Warner, co-chairs of the Senate India Caucus. We also have Indian Ambassador to the United States, Arun Singh, with us today. We thank you all for taking your time to join us here. I'm delighted at the level of leadership represented here today that really does further attest to the strategic importance of building a robust and lasting bilateral relationship between the United States and India. It's been personally an enormous pleasure to be involved in the Council's work on U.S.-India relations that has expanded significantly over the past year and a half under the very able leadership of Bharath Gopalaswamy, as he has taken control and leadership of our South Asia Center. I've accompanied Bharath on 2 occasions now to India during this last year. With each visit, as has been the case over the last 30 years of visits to India, I sense a growing enthusiasm, desire, and keen willingness to engage deeper and deeper with the United States. In fact, later this summer, I'll be traveling once again with Bharath and his team to India to host the first workshop of this particular initiative on trade. In forging collaboration on issues of trade and commerce, we hope to cement a pathway for broader and more effective cooperation between our 2 countries. Through our analysis and work that will include a series of workshops, our goal simply is to provide a forum, like the one today, to discuss some of the key issues coloring the debate and do our part to help leverage commercial and economic collaboration between our 2 countries. As a former trade negotiator, I recognize that this endeavor will not happen overnight. There are numerous obstacles to overcome before implementing bilateral trade treaties or even trade and investment framework agreements like the one I worked with some 15 years ago between the United States and India. However, the steps we're taking today and during the short term are crucial to the broader effort, and I believe will be imperative to achieving the joint goal set forth of raising U.S.-India trade to $500 billion over the next decade. Today's event will delve right into the meat of the issue, providing us the opportunity to understand and address some of the challenges that lie ahead. With that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Senator Cornyn, who saw the potential of a strong U.S.-India relationship very early in his career when he co-founded the Senate India Caucus, along with then-Senator Hillary Clinton. Senator Cornyn's remarks will be followed by comments from our other 2 panelists, Senator Warner and Ambassador Singh, both of whom have been instrumental in developing the bilateral partnership between the United States and India. We'll then enter our panel discussion moderated by Atlantic Council President and CEO Fred Kemp. Thank you all once again for joining us here. I'd like to remind everyone that this event is public and on the record. We encourage you to join the conversation online with the hashtag ACIndia. Thank you all very much. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Governor Huntsman, and thanks to all of you for having me here today, along with Senator Warner, my partner in all matters involving India and the U.S. Relationship in the Senate. I might just explain, as when I ran for the U.S. Senate in 2002, I, of course, traveled the state and was delighted to learn that some of the leading professionals and business leaders in my state were active in the Indo-American Chamber in Dallas, Texas. And in fact, we have a very sizable Indian American population in my state. I always have to add, though, that actually the 3rd most commonly spoken language in Texas today is Vietnamese, which usually surprises people. But it demonstrates what happens when you have a growing economy and a lot of opportunities. And so people literally are moving there, voting with their feet, coming from not only around the country, but around the world. As the governor said, my first trip to India was more than a decade ago, and the suggestion was made at the time that we start a U.S.-India caucus in the Senate, which I think remains the only country-specific caucus in the Senate. And because there was so much potential to be that we saw. And while it was Hillary Clinton who was my co-founder, Chris Dodd went on to serve, and then as different people moved on, I guess I stayed, but others moved on, and then Senator Mark Warner, my good friend from Virginia, and I have worked closely together on this important relationship. Trade is not a dirty word where I come from. And I think should be a positive thing for the United States. And this is an area where I think we can continue to grow that relationship with India. My state happens to be the largest exporting state in the United States. And although we've had significant trade with India, with Houston being the second largest U.S. port for trade in the country, but the fact is we can do a lot better. And I think the defense industry can and should be a major piece of this for economic and security reasons. And I'm encouraged by talk of a major sale, for example, of F-16s to India, and by the Defense Department's ongoing Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, the so-called DTTI, with India. Even though there's a lot of promise and potential, over the last few years, U.S. trade with India has actually plateaued, and trade between Texas and India has actually declined. We should be doing more to make sure that we can jumpstart this important trade relationship and improve it in the future and help mutually strengthen our economies. Now, one way we can do that is by bringing India into existing trade structures, like the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, or APEC. And this week I'll introduce legislation with Senator Warner that would direct the State Department to develop a strategy to help India obtain membership status in this organization and urge current APEC members to support India's membership. There's a companion bill in the House of Representatives, so I'm hopeful that we'll be successful in doing this because we frankly can't afford not to. Every time I travel to India or think about the important relationship, I'm reminded of the important values that our countries share. The world's oldest democracy, the world's largest democracy, and with so much potential and so much need geopolitically for our two strong democracies to remain leaders in our parts of the world and globally. We need to continue to do more and more to strengthen that. So I look forward to the discussion today and any ideas you may have about ways we can actually improve on that important strategic relationship. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Let me join my friend John Cornyn in thanking everyone from the Atlantic Council for this opportunity. Particular acknowledgement of my dear friend Jon Huntsman. As former governors, we have an immediate bond, and John, you're doing a great job here as chair of this the Atlantic Council. Senator Cornyn made mention of the fact that you said actually Vietnamese was the third most spoken language in Texas. I wasn't going to raise this. I've actually got a quiz question for this group. And if this group doesn't get it, I'm not sure who is. What is the fifth most widely spoken language in the world?
Hindi.
No, Hindi's higher than that. Bengali. A little fun factoid question. Bengali actually is the fifth largest spoken language in the world. That's not apropos of my remarks today, but I thought I'd just, put that in. Fun little factoid. I didn't realize it until, you get over towards Bengal and very much people in Calcutta remind you of the fact that Bengali is the 5th most spoken language in the world. I want to reiterate what John has said about this tremendous trade, cultural, growing ties between our two great nations. My journey in terms of ties to India, my wife and her brother, actually her brother-in-law has lived in South Asia for the last 40 years. She'd been to India before I traveled to India the first time as governor back in around 2004, 2005. At that moment in time, every governor around was traveling to China. No one was traveling to India, and was very proud to lead, at that point, the first state delegation, I think, for many decades, actually, of a governor leading a trip to India. And obviously that has now been completed as governors all across the country go to India on a regular basis. And the reasons for that are simply, back in 2000, trade between the United States and India was about $19 billion. We've now seen that number grow to over $100 billion. We now have seen India in the last year total growth at 7%. That actually tops out its neighbor to the east, so the fastest growing economy in the world is India, something that we ought to celebrate. John made mention of the fact as well that the U.S. India caucus in the Senate. Not only are we one of the only bilateral caucuses, but both the Senate U.S.-India caucus and the House U.S.-India caucus, we are the largest bilateral caucus in the Congress. So as an indication of the support and affinity between our two great nations, I think is reflected in that very, very broad, very bipartisan support that exists between the United States and India. We do aspire to get to that goal of $500 billion in terms of annual trade. That is it should not be an aspirational goal in terms of decades ahead. This should be literally only years away. One of the areas where I think there is great opportunity to increase this trade is in the defense realm. A great deal. I had some of the folks in from DOD recently. The amount of bilateral DOD visits between the Indian Armed Forces and the American Armed Forces is on a dramatic rise up. We need to continue that. Matter of fact, India is the second, I believe, largest purchaser of American defense goods, and we need to find ways to increase that. Senator Cornyn mentioned the DTTI, that defense trade framework, building on many ways upon then former Assistant Secretary Ash Carter's work, now Secretary Carter's work, in terms of that framework of the focus of defense trade relationship between the United States and India. And one of the things that I'm hopeful is that we often look at this on the defense side, the numbers between the United States and India only kind of on the top line dollar amount. That top line dollar amount is important, but by no means tells the whole story of both the chance and opportunity of increasing trade in the defense sector. One of the great assets that India has is India has enormous intellectual content, enormous intellectual development content, and some of the things we need to be working on are whether we take unmanned systems, for example, enormous opportunities for us to jointly partner and develop, not simply sell our equipment to India, but actually partner in development in areas like drones, in areas like advanced aircraft, even in areas around certain missile systems where we can have a win-win, where India can build up its national capacity, building on Prime Minister Modi's Made in India campaign, where we in America can leverage some of the great intellectual capital assets that are in India, and this kind of joint collaboration and cooperation, of which John and I are both very supportive, really is an area that I think offers great potential. I would be remiss in the 3 minutes that I have if I didn't also acknowledge where there's still some bumps. I mean, one of the things that I think all of us who are fans of India and look with great appreciation upon the bold agenda that Prime Minister Modi has laid out is the Prime Minister going to be able to, bring along the Indian bureaucracy to meet the kind of very ambitious goals that the Prime Minister has set out. Obviously, working through his internal bureaucracy is a matter for Indian domestic politics. As John and I will indicate, we sometimes have times with our own American bureaucracy getting things from a legislative idea actually being in terms of implementation. But this is an area that we'd hope to see more progress from the Indian side. We've seen some improvement here in terms of lifting the caps on FDI. We saw some of the caps lifted on insurance and some of the caps around the financial sector. We think if we're going to have a full and robust trading relationship with India, we need to continue to have our Indian partners lift the caps so that American and other outside investment can continue to flow into India without constraints in terms of caps on the amount of foreign ownership in key areas. A final area that I know Senator Cornyn and I have spent a lot of time working on, and we've talked with the ambassador about this, and it seems to be moving in, spurts and starts, and that is the fact that we need to keep the bilateral investment treaty a bit high on the priority list. Getting a bit in place, getting this bilateral investment treaty in place will give the level of confidence that investors in India, and for that matter, investors in the United States, will have to make sure that these investments cross countries are protected. Final comment I want to make is that I absolutely understand, particularly when we're talking on the defense side of the House, India's appropriate desire to build up its own defense capacity, its own intellectual capital, its own production facilities on the defense side. My hope as well is that as we think about this increased trade and as we work with India to build up their internal capabilities, that we also will continue to approach these questions, particularly around defense trade, on the question of offsets. There are a whole series of areas, I think particularly in terms of skills development, where India has enormous needs in terms of literally training tens of millions of young people every year to be prepared to work in a 21st century economy. In many ways, particularly around the community college level and others, America has a lot of knowledge on how we can train people up for the skills that are necessary. So it's our hope that as we look at this expanded trade area, we can continue to engage with our Indian partners on this question of offsets so that we can find areas, whether it be through training, whether it can be through infrastructure, where we can find areas that are both long-term goals for India, but also that can continue to allow these trade levels to increase between both of our countries. So with that, again, my thanks to the Atlantic Council for having another of these sessions, and I look forward to the conversation afterwards. Thank you very much.
I want to thank the Atlantic Council, Governor Huntsman, Fred Kemp, Bharat Gopalaswamy for taking this initiative. I also want to thank Senator Cornyn, Senator Warner for their leadership of the India caucus, for their leadership on issues related to India and India-US relations. And they have really made tremendous effort in advancing it in different directions. Much has already been said about what can and should be done in terms of the trade relationship with India. I would just like to add a few points to set the context from the Indian perspective. Despite the global headwinds, over the past 2 years, India has shown reasonably good rate of growth. Last year, we grew at about 7.5%, and the year before that at 7%. Most projections are that in the coming year, the rate of growth should be higher, because the expectation is that this year, on account of enhanced rural demand, because of much better monsoons and other factors, there would be an addition to the rate of growth, meeting what the IMF has projected as India being the fastest growing economy in the world. In terms of the investments in the coming year, there is going to be huge emphasis on infrastructure. It is, of course, an area where there is a need in India. But again, it is an area where, given the global headwinds, it is an opportune area for investment. And we are expecting more than $1 trillion worth of investment in infrastructure, for example, over the next 5 years. There is going to be significant modernization of the Indian railways. In the past 1 year, just as one indication of investment in infrastructure, we have added about 20 kilometers of highways every day. And again, the effort of the government is to take this figure to about 40 kilometers. Again, in terms of investment in infrastructure, looking at new ports, power, telecom, and smart cities, the government has identified as a first step 100 smart cities where we would look at more efficient energy usage, more efficient transportation, schooling, healthcare, and other aspects. And for first round of funding, again, 5 cities have been identified entirely based on a competitive process. And this is an area where US companies and the US TDA is already involved in doing some of the initial work and looking at opportunities ahead. If we just look at the trends in the US-India relations over the past few years, it is indicative of the direction that it will go in the future. Senator Warner referred to the fact that in the last 15 years, our trade has increased 5 times, and now we've set a target of $500 billion. US investment in India, which was about $8 billion in 2004, is now $28 billion. Just in the last 2 years, again, despite the global headwinds, US equity investment in India has gone up from $7 billion to $12 billion. FDI flows into India have gone up by more than 50%. And again, in the last 5 years, Indian investment in the United States, investment by Indian companies, has been $15 billion, creating 100,000 jobs directly and with a presence in more than 40 US states. Defense, clearly, again, as both Senator Warner and Senator Cornyn mentioned, will be an important area for trade and technology partnership. In the last 5 years, we have contracted to buy $14 billion worth of defense supplies from the US. And for some of the items that we have got from the US, outside the US now, the second largest presence of that equipment is in India. Some of it, again, for example, the C-130, C-17s, we have used very effectively when there was a humanitarian assistance requirement or evacuation requirement. For example, we evacuated people from Yemen when there was a crisis, including a certain number of US nationals using C-130 and C-17 aircraft. Now, in terms of areas where we will see potential in the future, I believe we should look at new opportunity and new technology. And one of those areas would be digital technology. US is the world leader in innovation, including in digital technology. Indian companies, Indian origin tech entrepreneurs, Indian origin tech workers are an integral part of that US leadership in the world in innovation and technology in this sector. Given the Indian strengths, I believe this is an area where we can partner effectively to enhance trade and other possibilities between our two countries. We are looking at a program of Digital India, expanding digital infrastructure in India, And using digital technology, we want to do things differently. Many examples in the United States have shown that digital technology is being used to disrupt business models. Now, how do we use that in India to enable us to do things differently, to enable us to meet our objectives, economizing on resources? So that's an area that we should all look at and what the opportunities would be. And again, that given the nature of Indian society and given the fact that it's an open society, there will be far more opportunity for digital technology. Today, for example, the second largest number of Facebook users in the world are in India after the United States. The largest number of WhatsApp users in the world are in India. Google is working on providing Wi-Fi to 500 Indian railway stations. We've seen reports of Microsoft bringing digital infrastructure to hundreds of thousands of Indian villages. So all this will create new opportunity for trade and investment flows. Another area that we should look at is renewable energy, because this is an area where we are going to have massive expansion in India. We need to grow at 8 to 10% to meet our needs in terms of poverty elimination, in terms of ensuring that those who do not have access to commercial energy today get access to such commercial energy, because that helps with education, with healthcare, with empowerment. And therefore, there is going to be huge emphasis in India on renewable energy. In about a year ago, the total amount of solar energy in India was 4 gigawatt. Last year, we added 7 gigawatt of new renewable energy, out of which 3.8 was solar. And the expectation is that in the coming year, we should be able to add at least 9 gigawatt of renewables, with a target of India having 175 gigawatt of renewables by 2022. A third area that I think we should focus on is innovation and startups. Because in India, a certain amount of cost-effective R&D and innovation work is taking place. Given the fact that our relative resource availability is different from the United States, where we are relatively more abundant in technically trained manpower and relatively scarce in capital, the way Indian researchers approach a problem is somewhat different. And CEOs of many US companies have told me that they developed products in India which they have been able to then market to other parts of the world, including Africa, Latin America, and certain parts of the United States. In the last 2 years, about $6 billion have flowed into startups in India. Several unicorns have emerged from India. And entities based in the Silicon Valley in technology and finance are very much a part of this process. So I think keeping these aspects in mind and making allowance for the fact that the political economies of the two countries are different, because the political economy of India is different from the political economy of the United States, and that there cannot be a cookie-cutter approach. The same principles, the same framework can't be applied to every country. With the understanding of this requirement for adjustment, for modification, I believe that we are today at a moment where there is tremendous opportunity for new areas of trade and investment flows between India and the United States. Thank you.
Sarah Cornyn, Sarah Warner, Ambassador Singh, that was just a wonderful launch for this event and for this initiative. Let me just tip my hat to two people before we get started. First of all, to Governor Huntsman, who has just been and continues to be such a wonderful chair of this organization. But just to give you a little bit of insight into what a resource he is when it comes to opening the Atlantic Council's relationship to India. Governor Huntsman is right. We were there, and I'll tip my hat to Bharat in a second, but we were there for a conference, our first conference in India. We did 2 last year, the first 2 in the Atlantic Council's 55-year history, and there'll be many more. But we had a meeting at that time that I want to tell you about with Prime Minister Modi. And we walked into the room. Modi threw his arms around Governor Huntsman. And it turns out that Governor Huntsman's daughter, Aisha, Asha. The first words he says to us are, "How's Asha?" So Asha, Governor Huntsman's daughter, is adopted from Gujarat, and they got to know each other as governors at that time. And they've kept in touch and known each other ever since. But to have the first comments in the Atlantic Council's first bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Modi to be, "How's Asha?" was actually a good starting point. Then a lot of the meeting, and you gentlemen know this because you've met with him, a lot of the meeting was not niceties, was not small talk. It was, what are you going to do for India? And how are you going to do something concrete? And so Prime Minister Modi, if you're listening in today, here we are. We're launching the initiative. We're doing something concrete. And this gets me to my tip of my hat to Bharat, who leads this initiative so admirably and leads our South Asia Center. He is quite literally a rocket scientist. He's a PhD in aeronautical engineering. So we are confident that he is going to get this one off the ground. And his team, he's also great at picking a wonderful team, and he has a magnificent team. So here's my first question. In some ways, and I'll start with you, Senator Cornyn, in some ways, maybe the easy part was getting from 8 billion to 28 billion, but now you have to get to 500 billion. How do you start to position yourself for those sorts of numbers, and will that be the hardest part? And in that context, you talked about how trade's a bad word in various places. I don't see any of the presidential candidates going out on the rostrum and arguing on behalf of free trade. What sort of context, what role will the American political context play in trying to hit this goal?
Well, I think the ambassador made the obvious point that the political economies of the United States and India are different. And I think while Senator Warner and I are often frustrated by the slow pace of progress in Washington, I think internationally you see the challenges are even bigger, and the time required to make progress is even longer. We were discussing before we came out the U.S.-India civilian nuclear deal that was inked in 2008. And the report, not the announcement, but at least the possibility that something might actually get done this summer with, I think, Westinghouse hoping to sell some nuclear reactors to India. So my point is, this is 2016. That happened in 2008. It takes a long time to get things done. But I think, given the fact that so much work has gone into getting the relationship in a good place, the strategic partnership, which obviously both countries feel are beneficial to ourselves and to each other and to the peace and prosperity in the world, I think we just ought to look for ways to continue to expand it, recognizing that things will always go slower than we would like, but some of the things that we discussed, for example, enhancing the trading relationship with India, is going to help both of our countries and help India continue to grow at 7% or more a year, a rate of growth which the United States would kill for right now.
Yeah.
So I think we've gotten this thing started, and we just need to keep making progress by encouraging it along the way and deconflicting where we can and providing additional avenues of economic growth and cooperation where we can.
And can this transcend the U.S. presidential election? How do you see this going into whatever a new administration is? And
you're asking Senator Warner that question, right? No, I'm kidding.
I'll ask him as well.
Well, unfortunately, I mean, Senator Warner and I are both supporters of the Trade Promotion Authority.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, trade has been important to the economic growth in my state, and I believe it's a good thing. Creates jobs and opportunity. Unfortunately, the benefits do not fall uniformly, and there are winners and losers, and we need to be attentive to that when it comes to retraining the workforce in the United States so that people don't end up paying the price personally for what is a societal benefit. But I think we're in a point of populism that we haven't seen in a long time in both political parties. I won't comment about the Democratic Party, but certainly Mr. Trump is not, you can't really evaluate him on the conservative to liberal scale. He's a populist, and he's appealing to people's frustration and anger right now. My hope is that
That was the most politically correct way I've ever.
my hope is that after the presidential election subsides, that we'll get back to what I think is a more sensible bipartisan support that Mark and I have had to deal with the trade issue, rather than reject something that's been an unalloyed good for our country and our economy.
And this, of course, is all my very prurient way to get on the nightly news with our event as well. So, Senator Warner, same two questions put a little bit differently. The 7 core areas we're addressing, or the initiative is addressing: smart cities, infrastructure, defense, financial institutions, trade agreements, international property rights. Again, with this goal of $500 billion, you spent a lot of time talking about defense. What is the route to get us started and pushed in that area? And then the other question is, what impact does the current mood about trade in the United States have on all of this?
Let me try to take it a couple of different ways. One, the part of my state that's probably been as disrupted by trade as, frankly, almost any region in our country is Southern Virginia. We call it Southside Virginia. Its industries were tobacco, textiles, and furniture. Not exactly industries in the 21st century many people go long on. Back when I was governor, we brought an Indian company named Essopropac in, took over a facility in Danville, Virginia. It dealt with polymer extractors. They came in, revitalized the factory, hired a couple hundred people, have gone through, I think, 3 expansions since that time. And at least in that corner of Virginia, the notion of trade and trade with India per se has a very different perspective. I sometimes will urge my Indian friends that as they look at trade opportunities in the United States and places to locate their operations, I think, frankly, too often they may pick Northern Virginia, New Jersey, California, places because in many ways that's where the Indian diaspora has located in America, and those are the obvious places to come and go and do business. The ability to try to say from as John and I as policymakers working with the embassy and others to encourage, as Indians think about direct investment in America, thinking beyond the kind of regular suspect areas, the value of bringing those operations to a Southside Virginia or to a West Texas, in terms of changing people's perception overall about trade, hugely, hugely opportunistic, and a value, frankly, to both sides. The folks at Essopropac, are great about telling the story of the quality of the workforce they've got in Southside Virginia. So, thinking about trade in terms of how you can take on this overall bigger macro concerns about trade, and as Indian companies look for direct investment in America, looking outside of the traditional regions, number one. Number two, I think as Americans realize that, particularly in terms of terrorist threats, extremist religious terrorist threats, that in so many ways, the United States and India are absolutely have common ground. Now, India has a proud history of being non-aligned, and I know they want to maintain on one level that status. On the other hand, the very terrorists that may be disruptive in Pakistan, that could lead to disruption in Afghanistan, are sometimes some of the same terrorists that may have been responsible for some of the actions within India itself. So the commonality of our nation's joint fight against terrorists, particularly terrorists that are religious extremists, I think open up an opportunity for common interest. Related to that, two last points would be, I understand that India wants to continue to build up its internal national capacity in defense, and particularly in terms of advanced technology. And candidly, I think the United States needs to be more forward-leaning on some of the product items that fall on some of the State Department, in effect, State Department banned lists of products that we can sell to India. Again, we have so much common interest. I think a continual review of products and even potential weapon systems that can be sold to India, that needs to be under constant review. Coupled with that, though, comes the question of offsets. There will be a period of time where there will not be enough Indian capacity in the short run to meet India's, one, defense purchasing needs, and two, for us to even if we didn't have state and DoD other restrictions, to transfer enough technology in a timely way. And when it comes to skills training and when it comes to infrastructure, and again, the ambassador made mention of the enormous needs that India has around infrastructure. Boy, oh boy, trying to bring American infrastructure expertise to help India develop its infrastructure, that is a win-win for India's economy and in terms of the kind of, I think, export of American expertise. And quite honestly, since we're not rebuilding enough of our own American infrastructure, some of that being put to work in India in the short term, I think is a tool that we could use right away as India continues to build up its own internal capabilities to take more of those defense offsets as some of these purchases go along the way. So, great opportunity when you look at rebidding some of those jets. I'm sure there's a chance here for us to do a good piece of business. And if we wanted to announce that today or when the Prime Minister comes in June, great opportunity.
The Atlantic Council's intellectual independence approach does not preclude deals being made on this podium. Mr. Ambassador, you may want to respond to things you've heard already, but I'd also like you to drill down a little bit on the idea of Digital India and how that comes together here. And maybe a broader question that may be related and not related is what could this mean to the individual Indian businessman or entrepreneur? If we actually fulfill this $500 billion, how does that get felt in India?
Mm-hmm. So I think first if we...
and I guess the point to that, and because I touched on digital, does it mean that there will be a boom in certain industries that would really be palpable out of this relationship?
Mm-hmm. So when we first look at the digital infrastructure, I think the sense is that in some areas it may be able it may enable us to economize on our resources. For example, without giving specific names, but the use of digital technology has in some way challenged the existing transportation models. And the use of digital technology has challenged existing hospitality models. Now, given our own constraints and shortages, how do we use digital technology to address some of those challenges in India? Shortage of hotels, for example, has an impact on tourism industry. And tourism is a major generator of employment and earnings spread all over the country. So these would be the kind of areas that we would look at in terms of using digital technology. It will also be very empowering, because as you know, one of the challenges we faced in India is to reach the last mile, to make sure that people in the remote areas, in the villages, have access to information, which they can then use for the economic and other activities. And this has been empowering. Some years ago, it was very difficult to get a landline connection in India. Today, 1 billion Indians use mobile phones. Just the other day, somebody in the digital technology sector in the US told me that today, there are 5 million people in India are coming online every month. So that's the rate at which this sector is now expanding. And that will generate a whole new opportunity for getting information and accessing the net to transact businesses. E-commerce, again, will provide opportunity in India when there are challenges related to infrastructure, retail space, and other areas. But as we do all this, I think, one, we have to make sure that people's livelihoods are not unnecessarily disrupted. Because for many people, the small-scale retail store in India is not just a matter of income, it's a matter of way of life and livelihood. How do you integrate that into the modern processes? And that can be done. Therefore, it requires a slight adaptation of the business model. And again, we have to make sure that there is sufficient employment generation for people. So we believe that by using digital technology, we will be able to spread the benefits of economic growth to a much larger segment of the population. And I'll give you just one more example. Over the past few months, 200 million people in India have been given bank accounts. And they were just brought into the banking structure. And their having bank accounts will now be used for providing them with different schemes, services, and sometimes government subsidies, so that the middleman is eliminated through this process. So there is a sense that this technology will enable us to meet our objectives much more efficiently and in a transparent manner.
Thank you very much. Let me go to the audience and see if we have some questions. Oh, yes, please, please. And anywhere along the way that any of you would like to jump in on each other, please do that. Yeah.
You know, this is what the ambassador just mentioned is actually an area where I think the United States may potentially can learn from India. The scope of some of the digital issues that you're taking on, the ability, as you know, to transfer benefits, cut out graft, immediately get resources down into a previously unbanked part of the community. I mean, we have some of those same challenges in the United States, and you know there may be examples and models that we can borrow from India. One of the things that I think that would be a great project, if not for the Atlantic Council, but for some other entity, would be, you know, there is a rich history and tradition of Indian undergraduates and graduate students, and even some postgraduate as young working, coming to the United States and studying, living, working in the United States. We do not have much of a flow going the opposite direction. And the idea of someone studying undergraduate studies in India or graduate studies, or even there's a couple of very successful Indian Americans I've talked to about, you know, could you get young cohorts of post-business school Americans going over to India and getting that kind of people-to-people, a year or 2-year exchange could have enormous long-term value for both countries.
If I could just comment on that to say that that is something that we are actively seeking to encourage. I believe that a large part of the expansion in the India-US trade and economic relationship has also been generated by Indians who came and studied here, and then either went back to India or then using their presence here and their understanding of the two countries built the trade and technology partnerships. And as more and more Americans go to India and are exposed to the economic and social systems there, I think they will be able to contribute to enhancing this relationship. So that's important, and we are certainly trying to encourage that.
So Senator Corner, maybe pick up on that before I go to the audience. You're talking to your constituents about how increased trade with India can affect the average American business Texan. What do you tell them? Where do you think that there may be some very interesting and specific gains for them, particularly business owner who seeks to invest in Indian companies, or vice versa, have Indian companies invest in them?
Well, because we have so many defense contractors in Texas, you don't have to really explain that because people already see the benefits. And the ambassador and Senator Warner talked about Prime Minister Modi's desire to create some of those production facilities to jointly produce some of these defense material, whether they be planes or whatever it is. In India is certainly understandable, and I think that would reflect the interests of both countries. But in my state, you don't really have to make that case. NAFTA, for example, is not a dirty word in Texas. We have 6 million jobs in Texas that are produced by cross-border trade with Mexico alone. So people understand that very well. I think as the diaspora in Houston and Dallas, for example, perhaps have as many as 300,000 Indian Americans who, as I said at the outset, are some of the best educated professionals, business leaders, academics in their communities. I think people just need to learn about the opportunity, and they will jump on it, because I think that those benefits have already been demonstrated, and just people are looking for an opportunity to join in that prosperity, and that comes from that kind of trade.
Interesting. Great. Thanks. Front row here. Paula, please, though I know you, identify yourself and to whom you'd like to address a question. Got lots of questions. Thank you.
Paula Stern, member of the Atlantic Council Executive Committee. Ambassador referred to the headwinds, global headwinds, and the prospects of India growing even faster than 7.5 to possibly above. From a macroeconomic point of view, that would be fabulous for the world. And I'm just wondering whether you think it will have that kind of adequate spillover effect to really dampen the overarching global headwinds that we're all feeling. And from a micro point of view, I'd like to understand better Senator Warner's point about training, the opportunities for Americans, as I understood it, possibly through services, to be finding places for training. And I don't fully understand that, given, as you suggested, Ambassador, the abundant technological capacity of India itself. I'm wondering what you feel we can bring that's our U.S. comparative advantage to India from a training point of view.
So first for you, Mr. Ambassador, then Senator Warner.
So I think I would say that the global headwinds are, of course, clear in terms of the rates of growth that we see around the world. But we believe that we should be able to sustain our rate of growth despite that because of the investment that we are going to do in infrastructure, which we need to do, and there is huge opportunity. And second, at least this year, now the expectation is that the monsoons would be good. And therefore, last 2 years when we grew despite inadequate monsoons, with a good monsoon, there'll be higher agricultural productivity and growth. And almost 70% of our population is dependent on agriculture, even though agriculture contributes only 14% of the GDP. But there will be more rural income generated and rural demand, and therefore. So although the positive growth in India would certainly impact also on the global economy, but given the size of India's GDP, the impact would not be beyond a certain point, because it's a little above a $2 trillion economy, not the $8 trillion or a $14 trillion economy like the US. So the impact would be there, but it will have some limitation. In terms of skills, clearly we have a certain amount of technical capacity, but we have to invest a lot in skill development because the skills we need in India for manufacturing are not quite there. And even in the IT and other sectors, we are running into supply issues. So there will have to be a lot of emphasis on skill development. And I think one challenge that all countries are now facing is that with increasing globalization, there will be a constant flux
in the kind of jobs that can be done in each country. And the workers have to be skilled not just to do a particular kind of job, but to be able to adjust and modify as the trends change. And therefore, the government in India itself has put in a lot of emphasis on skill development. And in fact, this government has set up a special ministry for entrepreneurship and skill development, because it is recognized as an area of priority.
Well, let me just add, one of the last trips I was there, I met a young man, and he had been, during the previous government, he'd been charged with creating skills training for 30 million young people a year. 30 million a year. And I think many of us, at least from America, we think of Indian education system, and everybody knows somebody who went to one of the IITs, and Indians are rightfully proud of the IIT system, but what appears to be a gap is, where is the Indian equivalent of the community college system? And where is the equivalent of the place that's going to train the literally hundreds of thousands of additional truck drivers, plumbers, electricians? Much of that is done in still the ad hoc, semi-informal economy in India. So the idea, as many challenges as our community college system has, we still have cracked that code better than most. And so on one of my more recent trips, we brought the Virginia Community College system in, and we formed a collaboration with the Indian Ministry of Education and an Indian American gentleman, Ramesh Wadhwani, and the Wadhwani Foundation, looking at how we could bring and port over those kind of community college structure and systems for that wide swath of Indians that, candidly, just as in the United States, not everybody's going to become a coder. Who is going to drive a truck, fix your refrigerator, have the other kind of mid-level skills that India is actually missing that gap in their skill development?
Thank you. Very good answer. Please.
Thanks very much, Fred, and congratulations on this initiative. Nelson Cunningham with McClarty Associates. And I was just in Delhi earlier this month. Senator Cornyn, I was interested in your comments about APEC and about encouraging the U.S. to encourage India to join APEC. One of the points of our visit there was we were there touting a Peterson Institute study, which said that if every APEC country joined TPP, and if India then joined TPP, within 20 years it would lead to $500 billion in exports a year from India to the TPP countries. It's a very powerful study. The first step, of course, in this process would be for India to join APEC and for it to be welcomed by the other APEC countries. I'm curious, Senator Cornyn, Ambassador Singh, Senator Warner, what do you think the prospects of this bill are and of that moving forward?
Please.
Well, I'm optimistic. I can't imagine much in the way of organized opposition, so maybe we just ought to quietly pass it and put it on the president's desk and not let the presidential candidates know what we're trying to do. But you mentioned the issue of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Obviously, that remains a work in progress, given the headwinds. We were talking about headwinds of the presidential campaign on both sides. And Senator Warner didn't talk about the headwinds on the Democratic side.
I think we'll come back to
that. But he will, I'm sure. This is really important for all sorts of reasons. One, the 12 countries that are immediately involved, the fact that it involves 40% of the world's GDP in Asia, and the fact that if we don't write the rules, China by default will. But you make the very important point that this can be then the point of coalescing by countries as large as India and others in the region. Maybe even China at some point would want to join the TPP. There's a lot of upside potential to this, to regularize the trading rules, to reduce tariffs. Again, I think to have the impact of growing the economy and creating a lot of jobs in the countries affected. So I think we'll start little steps for little feet, and we'll start where we can. And I think where Senator Warner and I are starting is eminently doable, but then the sky is the limit.
Senator Warner, I think if you can address the question, but also I think I'm being accused of not being even-handed and prompting you to
No, not
answer.
you, him.
No, I know. I'm taking the blame on myself.
Headwinds on the Democratic side? What? Newsflash. No, let's put it like this. I think we are, candidly, I think most all of us have been surprised on both political parties in terms of how this process has gone. I mean, John and I are both supporters of trade. I think, I speak on a personal basis, I think as advocates of trade, we've made arguments at the macro level about how it's good. We have not been as willing to acknowledge that in every deal there are winners and losers, and there are wide swaths of our country concentrated disproportionately in rural and smaller communities that have not done all that well by past trade deals, and that for the most part our trade assistance programs, as well-intentioned as they have not been terribly effective, both in terms of the training and the training for jobs that may be in the region where the jobs have been lost. And I think we have to, just again, let me speak on, not make this any bigger than just my personal view, making the argument and demonstrating, quite honestly, that not only does trade help create more world wealth, create more benefits, I do worry at times, this is an editorial comment separate from trade, that, and I say this as somebody who's done pretty well by our free enterprise system in this country, I do worry that sometimes the free enterprise system that I grew up with in America has morphed at times into a short-term focused, quarterly based returns at the expense of long-term value creation, oftentimes at the expense of investment in human capital. And that has created a huge amount of discontent that manifests itself in both political parties at this point. And for people like John and I, who we disagree on a lot of things, but there's an awful lot we agree on, we got to sort this out in a way that we can continue to make the case that increased trade is beneficial, that America can compete and win against anybody as long as they're a level playing field. And at times I don't think we've brought it back down to that individual enough.
Senator, thank you. Do you want to deal with the APEC question,
Well,
Indian
just to say
APEC, Indian
that,
TPP?
recently the Asia Society Policy Institute had also come out with a study which pointed out to the advantages for both India and the United States from India's membership of APEC. And when President Obama had visited India in January last year, the joint statement that was issued, there was a reference to APEC. So let us see how we advance this.
Great question, Nelson, please.
Thank you very much. Raghuveer Goyal, I'm a journalist in Washington with India Globe and Asia Today. This is a very timely panel discussion because the relations between the US and India are on the forward and flourishing. This relation really started with President Clinton, and then President Bush opened the doors between the two countries wide open. And then, of course, President Obama visited India twice, and he had gone further steps. My question is now that President Obama has been dealing with two administrations, Manmohan Singh, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and now Prime Minister Modi. Prime Minister Modi will be there for years to come, I believe, but President Obama will be gone in the next few months. So what do you think the future of US-India relations, and what do you think the message you have for the future message for the Modi government? Thank you, sir.
To whom would you like to address the question?
Anybody.
Okay, well, I think this is really for the two senators. Is there a difference right now going forward versus a Republican-Democratic candidate, or is India on a different sort of track than that at the moment?
No, I think is reflected by the fact Mark and I are co-chairs. We've tried to always make the relationship bipartisan. You learn in Washington the only way you ever get anything done is to make it bipartisan. People keep coming here and say, well, I'm going to do this, do that on a purely partisan way, and they always fail. And so the only thing that is sustainable are bipartisan programs, and certainly the relationship with India is bipartisan. Unfortunately, when Prime Minister Modi came to the United States, I think the first time after he was Prime Minister, the Congress was not in session. And so we weren't able to host him for a joint session of the Congress. My hope is that when he comes, I believe in the early June, is that right, Mr. Ambassador? That we will be able to host him, and I think give him also that, that's up to Speaker Ryan, by the way, but I think he's favorably inclined. But I think to provide a bigger platform for not only the Prime Minister, but also for the relationship, and so more and more people understand the importance of it, and that will make sure it transcends any sort of partisan appearance or nature.
And any of you looking as journalists in the audience for small news nuggets, don't miss that last one.
If I could just add to that.
Just a minute. Yeah, Ambassador.
If I could just add to that to say that in my own work here, and as luck would have it, I was here in 2008. Yeah. And I was here in 2012, and I've come back for 2016. And in my own interactions on the Hill, clearly there is a bipartisan support for the India relationship, and that gives us all an opportunity to work forward.
Senator Warren, you agree with that?
I agree. I think that there is there are very few countries where there is as much, I think, uniform good feeling in the United States Congress as there is towards India.
I agree.
Great, thank you. Please, right here. And I'll navigate, I've got lots of questions. I'll navigate this as best as I can.
Okay. Hello, Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. I have a quick question. I write mainly to women, and recently I had my 14-year-old. I let her select a friend to take to Disney World this summer. Her friend has the same name as Governor Huntsman's daughter. She's from India. And her parents had a lot of concerns because I'm a Republican. I met with them, I had samosas, and I sat on their couch, and I had to convince them to let me take their child to Disney World because they had some very serious concerns about their child spending a week with a Republican.
Not Disney World.
Yeah, I assured them that I went using Google. I showed them they had the halal diet. I would respect their religious beliefs. They're Muslim. And I can see the concerns with members of Congress. And now because of this incident and having to lobby to bring a child to Disney World, I would like to know what you've seen, senators. We've taken a step back. Because I feel, as a parent, we've taken a step back, and I'm worried about our society. And I would just like your opinions. Thank you.
I apologize. I don't want to sound glib, but are you saying was there a step back in terms of Disney? I missed.
A step back as far as relations with the people, as far as moving forward and forming more cooperation, because we want to get deals, we want to get do more business together, but when you have people wanting to build like a trust.
Well, that may be more of a question for the ambassador. What is the mood in India right now toward the United States, and is it being colored in one way or another, Democrat, Republican? Does that sound right?
That sounds a lot better.
Okay. No, but they were totally okay with going to Disneyland, which is what surprises me about the question. Yeah, fine.
No, I think the mood in India related to the U.S. is clearly very, very positive.
Yeah.
If you look at the business community in India, for them, as they look at moving ahead with technology, trade, production, engagement with the United States is very important. If you look at the middle class in India, the U.S. universities, the U.S. education system, and the business opportunities flowing from that, again, with flows in both directions, are very, very important. There's a lot of admiration for the U.S., for all the values it enshrines. And again, I must share with you that these days, of course, when I travel travel to different parts of the US, I'm often asked at speaking engagements that how do you explain what's going on in the US to people in India? And I give a two-part answer. I say, first, as a foreign diplomat accredited here, I can't comment on political processes in the US. And once they're satisfied with that, then I say, look, it's very easy for me to explain what's happening here to people in India, because we are a very noisy and vibrant democracy. So,
Yeah, if anything, and I'm not as frequent a traveler to India as many of you here, but if anything, I find the mood is quite different than it was during the non-aligned period, where there was a lot more questioning of the U.S. and U.S. purpose in the world, but that may be in the circles that I've been in. Vipin, please, if you identify yourself and to whom you'd like to address the question. Yep.
Vipin Sejwani, a friend of Fred and Atlantic Council. Those of us who are not so young, remember some false stats in the past, whether it was related to, GATT or WTO or the recent climate change. How is this initiative going to be different in terms of removing or learning from those past lessons and removing these roadblocks and take it really forward? And it's a challenging question for many of us who live here.
Let me take at least one crack at that. I think if you take it in any kind of semi-historical context, it was 25 years ago, and the relationships between India and the United States were frigid at best. You still had India's leaders in the non-aligned movement. Most of their defense relationships were with, still at that point, late 80s, early 90s, with Russia and the Soviet Union. You've seen, an opening of the Indian economy. You've seen, I think, as was mentioned, initially with President Clinton, and then, giant steps taken under President Bush with the opening of the nuclear agreement. In many ways, kind of a coming of age of the Indian American diaspora here on the political front, continuation. With President Obama, I think we've kind of gone from this blush of, because everyone in India-U.S. relationships always use the same lines, the world's oldest democracy and the world's biggest democracy, and then we talk about shared values, and and we've all given the same speech at times before. But I think what's happened has been, this relationship has evolved. We had this moments of, particularly say, 06 through early 08, of euphoria. We're going to get this nuclear agreement done really quickly, and we're going to have everything else is going to be, we're going to be in perfect alignment. And, we're two great powers where we have similar interests, but we also have our own each independent interests. And I think where we are at this point is that we've gone from a kind of burst of enormous friendship to a ongoing mature relationship of trust, of mutual respect, of areas, for example, I think around not only trade, but particularly in terms of the defense area. Dramatically increased cooperation. Who could have even envisioned, 8 years ago, the level of defense-to-defense interactions between India and the United States? And a lot of that is, again, because two of the world's greatest democracies, a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have our interests aligned. Our interests align in terms of a stability in Afghanistan. Our interests align in recognizing that Pakistan being disruptive in Afghanistan or constantly fearing only India, that India has kind of risen to a different rank within the hierarchy of power. So I think we're in a stage where our relationship is matured. There will be incidents. We've had recent incidents on H-2B visas. We've had incidents a year and a half ago with the circumstance with the diplomat in New York. I mean, there have been bumps along the way. There have been challenges with the Indian Americans who are within the Indian judicial system. But these are bumps in a relationship that I think in the past, if we'd had these bumps, could have led to a real fraying of the relationship, but instead they're bumps in an otherwise mature and continuing to mature relationship. That make any sense?
Yeah. Senator Cornyn, picking up on that a little bit and what you said, Senator Warner. So if all of that is the case, what's the point of setting the goal? Free economies, free countries and all that business. What do you achieve by setting the goal at 500 billion? Is this about public-private partnerships? Is it just to get more people more aspirational?
I think it's to sort of raise the bar and to show the potential of the relationship. I mean, we can certainly go beyond $500 billion once, but the idea is that where we are now, we can scale this up and make it bigger, and if the benefits are obvious to people in the United States and to India, then we will, in the alignment of our self-interest, continue it. And I think we're optimistic that we will.
And that gets measured, that gets done.
Yeah.
Bump it to 500 billion, great. Get a bit in place, that adds a whole level of trust. A bit in place in terms of the trust level that will give to investors on both sides. Makes sense. Continuing to work through defense offsets and continuing to really realign Indian defense procurement with the United States. Boy, you talk about something that really will bind our countries together, because we won't, of course, mention other countries in the region, but we both have concerns about other emerging nations in the region. We both have concerns about the threats of religious extremism. I mean, there's enormous amounts of even if there was not kind of diplomatic friendship and two great democracies, just both of our national interests align in so many places.
Did you want to jump in on this?
I think it was an important question, so if I may just add a few comments on that. Because we've not had a practice in the past decades of working so closely together, as we are working more and more together, for example, India and the US now do more military exercises with each other than with any other country bilaterally. People are asking questions about what kind of relationship is this? And President Obama has said it is a defining partnership of the 21st century. Two of our prime ministers have said we are like natural allies, although we don't say we are an ally because we are not looking for military alliances. The Council on, and a lot of people are struggling as to how to define this relationship. The Council on Foreign Relations recently brought out a study where they said it's a joint venture, where you work together on common interests. I remember after Secretary Carter visited India, there was a newspaper comment saying, a warm handshake, but not an embrace. So US sees itself as an exceptional country. In India, we also see ourselves as an exceptional country. And there's tremendous assertion in India that in any partnership that we build, there must be the strategic autonomy of our decision making. And so that's very important. However, given all this, there's a recognition in both the countries that there is a lot of convergence of our interests. And therefore, how do we work together to maximize that convergence and utilize that convergence to our advantage? And I think what's happened is that we now have a habit of working together, of discussing and managing our differences and disagreements far better than we did in the past. And I think all this will provide us a way to keep going forward.
Excellent answer. I think this is going to have to be the last question here, and if I'm not mistaken, Bharat, yes?
Thank you. I have two questions, both involving planes. First one is, after an impassioned plea on the Senate floor, Senator Rand Paul asked his Senate colleagues to not table his motion to block the sale of F-16s. I think both of you senators voted differently. If you want to, could you explain your rationale on why you voted in that way as co-chairman of the India caucus, given the concerns of religious extremism in Pakistan? And the second one, as someone who grew up in Texas and now lives in DC, the one thing I've always longed for is a direct flight from both of those areas to India. So perhaps you can pontificate on
Work on that.
how long we have to wait for that.
I think there is a direct flight from DFW. There is?
Actually,
I believe so.
we're trying to get one from Dulles, not from BWI. And I actually voted against, I voted with Senator Paul, not for Senator Paul's specific reasons, but because of my grave concerns about Pakistan's behavior. But let me also state that, on the Democratic side, these Indian co-chairs come and go, Clinton, Dodd, Warner, nobody's a better friend of India than John Cornyn. He stayed as a co-chair of this caucus for more than a decade, and he ought to be celebrated for that.
Well, just as we've been discussing, each of our countries has to pursue our national interest and not be forced to pick between different countries. Clearly, the United States needs to maintain our engagement with Pakistan. I believe, because obviously Pakistan is, because of geography, because of history, even though I do not, and many of us do not approve of a lot of their policies and what they're doing, particularly in supporting some terrorist activity in Afghanistan, the Haqqani Network and others. But I believe it's important for us to maintain a relationship with Pakistan, which is the reason I voted the way I did, not because I believe Pakistan is always a good actor. I think that's a complicated relationship, which is the reason why you saw the divergence of voting on that. But I don't think anybody's fooled by the complexity and the importance of trying to resolve our relationships with both Pakistan and India. As I said, I don't think the United States is going to be asked to choose between the two. We need to be actively engaged in pursuit of our national interests with both.
Time has run out. I know there are at least a dozen other people who've been trying to get questions, and I apologize I didn't get to you all. This is the first volley of this new initiative. We hope that all of you will stay engaged with it. On the question of India and Pakistan, the South Asia Center, the Atlantic Council, has a long relationship working on both. In fact, we've done some work called Waging Peace, because we actually see that this is a particularly important region to ensure that that you don't have breakout of hostilities, because it is so crucial, and we don't have to remind people here that there are a lot of nuclear weapons in the region as well. We welcome you in. We are as much a do tank as a think tank. We're really trying to push forward this initiative because we think it's in the interest of both countries and the larger region and the world as well. So thank you, Senator Cornyn, Senator Warner, Ambassador Singh. That's great. That was great. Thank you.